morning, everyone. I'll try to speak slowly for the interpreters. First of all, let me point out that I am not an accounting historian. So I won't be talking about accounting history, but the history of the concepts and the words at the roots of accounting. My work aims just to bring material, to bring substance, and then you will be responsible for reformulating these ideas. So I'll be talking about documents that show where these fundamental notions come from. In order to understand the forks in the road in the history of accounting, we need to know this history to be able to reformulate it for our own purposes. To start, the words capital and risk are very modern words, especially when you put them together, venture capital, risk capital. And these words were born together and appeared together in Pisa in 1140. Let's start with the word capital, from the Latin adjective capitalis, principle. Has influenced a lot of vernacular languages. Just a point, Romance languages developed gradually in the different regions between the 8th century. This is where the lingua franca of Latin, a difference emerged between written Latin and spoken Latin, and spoken Latin developed into vernacular Romance languages. So the first written Italian resources are from the 13th century, which is very late. But in the meantime, we can see an evolution of spoken Latin into these vernacular languages. And so we look at the differences between the spoken and written Latin, and especially the individual words that emerge in vernacular languages. A lot of these documents we used are commercial contracts drawn up by notaries. So it may seem strange, but the word capital is a vernacular word, capitale, that we find in Latin texts. Because when Latin words were transformed, the pronunciation of words was transformed. Capitalis would give, for example, châtel or châtel in Occitan, catal in Catalan, etc. This was a natural evolution. However, capitale in Italian is a word that did not change. It was a word that was reinvented by notaries. This is important to keep in mind because in French, for example, châtel led to the word cheptel, which is livestock. So we all in all, when we look at the evolution of this word capitalis, capitale, the notions may change, but they always refer to the resources that a person or a body may own. Now, what I'm talking about is a reconstruction through deduction, because we don't usually have we don't necessarily have these original documents from Pisa, keeping in mind that Pisa and Venice were the trade capitals of Eastern Italy. There have been a lot of debates on the origin of the contracts that these notaries used. Sometimes they were based on Roman law, sometimes based on Muslim law, sometimes the Greek world, but there's always something new in these contracts. And this novelty we see in principle with the word risk, which appeared at the same time and in the same documents. Risicum is the root of all words meaning risk in European languages. But the original word risicum just to keep in mind that the dictionary Trésor de la langue française has a mistake. It talks about a transmission of the word from Greek into Latin, but if we look at the documents closely, there's no doubt that the word comes from Arabic. Because merchants in Pisa were trading mainly with North Africa. And so risicum comes from the Arabic word resk. So this Arabic word resk with an E is attested in these North African regions that traded with Pisa. And there are, in fact, a lot of Arabic words that have come into European languages, and risk, naturally, is one of them. Words such as douane, customs, or arsenal, these are well-known words that we know their origins. They're all Pisan, and before Pisa from the Arabic world. Now, where do these words come from? Different types of contracts. They could be corporate contracts, but generally they're what we call cobanda contracts. This is the Italian word. These are basically order contracts. The comanda is a contract in which an investor provides goods to a merchant who will go to another place to sell this merchandise, these goods. And then with the proceeds of these sales, will purchase other goods to be sold elsewhere or brought back to the home port. This was the sales cycle, the trade cycle. And the cycle continued throughout the merchant's travels until the return to the home port, where everything was analyzed and the accounts were drawn up. So there's the idea also of profit as well, and we differentiate between the original amount invested and the profit calculated at the end of the transaction. However, from the very beginning, distribution of profits is set out. Now, what's important to see is that the goods are at the risk of the investor. So the question is, why take this word of risicum? And some notaries do not use this word. And so in some Genoan documents, we see the word fortuna instead of risicum. But in Pisa, we see risicum. And I think that the difference is that risicum is neutral from a theological standpoint, from a personal standpoint. Now, in Arabic, it's not neutral. Resk is a Muslim term. It refers to the Quran. But in the Latin used by notaries, there was no moral or theological dimension. We have another modern example, which is the French word aléa, which means unforeseen event, because the word risk has taken on a negative connotation, whereas unforeseen event is much more neutral. So basically, at your risk means at your responsibility. It's a question of legal responsibility taken on by the investor with regard to the capital invested. So there was a practical reason to invent a word that was not tied to the idea of fortune. Fortune usually has very positive connotations. Think of medieval times when there was the wheel of fortune, which could be positive, it could be negative. But in the end, the word fortuna simply had too many connotations, and so it was judged preferable to take this word resk from Arabic, which became risicum. Now, as I said, around the year 1140, this vocabulary came about in Pisa, but passed into the vernacular very quickly. We have a document from an abbey in Fiastra for a rural contract, a livestock rental contract that has the word abrisiku, which is a neologism of risicum in the vernacular. In the document platform that you have access to, you'll see documents about this. We see then this word circulating throughout the Mediterranean world, with the exception of Venice. Amazingly, the Western Mediterranean, Genoa, Marseille, Catalonia, all over the Western Mediterranean basin. Also, the word capital. We can see this word capital in the earliest Italian documents. So we have here accounting documents talking about prode e capitale, profits and capital. So we can see an introduction to an accounting, a set of accounting documents that talks about the capital of the associated companies, etc. So capital became a notion in accounting as of the 13th century. And in Marseille, which at the time was not a major trading center compared to Pisa or Genoa, but Marseille is the only place where we see the verb resigare, so the verb to risk, meaning to use capital in a business venture. And we see the expression to risk both by land and sea. This was originally used for maritime contracts, but became adopted for land trade contracts as well. So in this notion of risk, there is no connotation of specifically maritime risk. Sometimes we can see the expression at your risk and at the fortune of the sea. So the two ideas are dissociated. It's simply a moral responsibility taken on by an investor. Now, I'd like to look at this author. This book is not well known, but I think should be known well. And we're passing it around the room. It's an analysis of the history of economic thought. It's a course in Narbonne in the 13th century by a Franciscan professor who has been completely erased from history because he was accused of being a heretic. But he was a great philosopher, theologian, and I would say he's a Franciscan version of St. Thomas of Aquinas. And it's a pity that this work has been neglected in history. He responds to St. Thomas of Aquinas, and in this case, a course on contracts from the city of Narbonne, which was a trading center, not a philosophic center. And he talks about classic themes, usury, etc. But in this course, he talks about contracts used at the time in the Languedoc region in southern France. And when looking at these contracts, he does not focus on the negative aspects. He simply says that a good merchant has more chances of getting to heaven than a corrupt priest. So he is Franciscan, so he's in favor of Franciscan poverty, but at the same time, he understands the meaning of commercial transactions provided that they're useful for society. It is the first text where we see really most of the modern conceptualization of economics. As a philosopher, he basically conceptualizes what had been going on for a century and a half. There were other thinkers who looked at these subjects earlier, but he's the first one really to look at capital and risk. For centuries, his writings were ignored. But his texts were taken up by Bernardo of Siena in the 17th century. Now I'm looking back on history and reconstructing this history. In 1318, the convent where he was buried was destroyed, and at the time the Franciscans were banished and ended up in Italy. And years later, the Bernardin orders found and analyzed and took up these writings. Now, in the Middle Ages, we weren't talking about plagiarism. It was a common practice to take up useful texts. We have many examples. So Antonino of Florence took up some of the most interesting ideas. And these texts were reprinted and circulated until the 18th century. They were really a foundation of the second scholastic, where theological ideas of the 13th century came back into vogue in the 18th century world. Now, nobody discusses this author, but his ideas are very present. So we can see traces of his work even in the 18th century. But so I think the history of economic thought is a history of the degradation of the original medieval ideas. It's not a path towards the Enlightenment, but rather ideas that are being fettered away. So he discusses this idea of capital and even defines the concept of capital. I give you the Latin. Now we'll read the translation of capital. That which is intended through a firm decision of the owner to produce a probable profit that is not simply money or the same goods, but contains also a seminal reason of profit that we would normally call capital. And when he says that we commonly call capital, it means in the vernacular. This means that the word capitale was in the vernacular at the time. And keep in mind that capitale, it might sound like a Latin word, but it was an Italian word at the time. And the word capital has kept its meaning in all Romance languages and even in Germanic languages. And he continues, he who holds capital must not simply return the value, but must offer added value. So we have here this idea of added value. So there's a distinction between monies, and then there's a different type of contact where money is thought of not just as money, but capital, a sort of a temporal equivalence. Now, he says also a seminal reason. This is a theory from Agostino. And the author I was mentioning, Pierre de Jean Olivier, rejects this technical idea. But the idea is simply that the idea behind capital is a merchant's decision to invest money with the expectation of future profits. So take the example of £100 or today €100. The imaginary idea that these €100 are indeed worth more or are probably worth more. And there's even a passage that says that this probable profit can be assessed and even sold in advance. This looks like the first insurance policy. We see then that it's acceptable for an investor to sell a probable profit before the transaction itself takes place, before the merchandise is sold. So there's this idea of a probable profit, which is one of the most interesting ideas. Another passage that describes the same thing we'll look at now. It says that capital as capital, when intended for profit-based trade, adds a certain profit-based character to the money taken in itself. So there's a character of profit that goes above the idea of money itself. So we can see that in the late 13th century, we could see capital. We could see a much deeper analysis of capital than we might have expected. And Olivier knew that all merchants in the area were engaged in trade, that they were good Christians as well. So he decided that this type of contract could be just. The main question then was, is the sharing of profit a just notion? That was the main, justice was the key criteria. We can see the Franciscan character in the idea of free agency, of free will.
And he cannot possess or own anything in spite of himself. So let's, not forget about Franciscan life, which is based on total poverty and giving up all resources. So you have to be able to totally detach yourself. So, again, free will is fundamental for him. And we were talking about the will-based or free will-based concept of the Franciscan. And so it's within the institution and without the anarchist concept. But philosophically, it leads us quite far, and a very influential thinker with a whole school that follows in his footsteps. But there's this concept of free will, and it's we owe it to Olivier. So, Olivier, first conclusion I'd like to draw regarding the question of a probable profit deriving from capital. So with Olivier, there's a sort of a victimization of a yield of capital, whereas on the other hand, he maintains that it is forbidden. You can't actually have any usury on consumer goods, and it has nothing to do. And I think it's very interesting from a conceptual viewpoint to think that the issue of the yield rate has nothing to do with interest rate. I think there's a lot of confusion around this question. A lot of people think it's the same thing, but these are totally different matters. And Olivier says, on a loan, he doesn't call it a consumer loan, but the usury rate in the definition of the canon law of the School of Bologna, which defines the exact terms at the end of the 12th century. So usury is defined as, a remuneration of a loan of things that are intended to be consumed and that will disappear once they are used or consumed. So classical examples is wine, money, and grain or cereals. So money is something that is to be consumed just as food is intended to be consumed. You can't do anything else with money apart from consuming it. So a consumer good based loan is the traditional form of usury practice in the Middle Ages, as you know, peasants who were finding it difficult to have both ends meet, and they will ask for a loan for grain, oil, wine, or money to buy these very same goods. So it's a consumer good loan, where it'll be consumed whilst being used, and if you follow canon law, you shouldn't ask anything, in return as a possible compensation. It's forbidden, and if you if you actually take a loan of 10, you'll give back 10. I mean, if you ask for a bottle of oil or wine, you will be actually, if you get a loan for a bottle of oil or wine, you will return that same bottle of wine. And in the New Testament, there's the rules, where there's a moral concept which is still valid. So it's a very interesting theory on, what are the laws of the Old Testament that are still valid for a Christian. I mean, the Christ, has he banned or the law, or has he abolished certain rituals, which are ritual prescriptions or legal definitions that have no longer value, whereas all the moral side of things of the Old Testament. So it's interesting. Olivier is in Narbonne, which is a highly intellectual Jewish city, and very little trace of the Jewish presence. But he actually exchanged with a lot of Jews. Is the only one to know, a passage of Rashi, a major commentator of the Jewish law, established in the Champagne area in the 12th century. So, and he could have only have known about this through the discussion with rabbis in Narbonne, even if he doesn't say it. But obviously, that is what happened. So it's not the same thing at all, banning of usury rates, and also having gaining profit from investing capital. It seems perhaps very strange. And why? Because the sociological reality that you have to keep in mind. The consumer good loan, it takes place, within the community, in a political community. So the first part of the treaty on the fair price is dominated by concepts of policy of the community. And this is basically, on the city and the city, the commune of Narbonne, until Olivier's times. It'll change very quickly after him. It is a city, Narbonne, which is capable of actually passing its own laws, because Narbonne takes power a little bit at the end of the 13th century, and they lose it, to the benefit of the king and his agents. But at this very moment in time, people are thinking about social justice, which is actually to be imposed by the consuls. These are the bourgeois of the time. And there's this concept of a justice, a fairness, a equal sharing amongst the members of the community. And so that is the reason why you cannot actually ask to be compensated for a loan you may have actually awarded to someone. And a very interesting text to read, and it's the treaty on the fact that to trade you cannot pay through a profit of. Oh yes, you can get a profit from merchants who are actually providing goods that are not available. But again, it's always in the name of the common good. And this is quite different from the today's economic thought process. So again, what comes first is the moral good of individuals and of the community as a whole. So much for what I wanted to say about actually setting the scene now regarding profitable commercial exchanges. That's something that's outside of the community, and whether it's sea or land transport, it's the same. So I wanted to set the scene. So that's how, in relation to us, it is a major difference. We're not in a homogeneous context from a political standpoint. It is somewhat complicated. I don't want to go into too much detail to actually attribute to everyone, not only merchants who are acting outside of the community, to provide them with the capacity of investing to make a profitable investment, that is, and it's quite complicated. So the justification, so there's two sides to this. You have to distinguish between, again, the yield rate and the interest rate. So in reality, interest rate is something that actually appears very soon in France. It's in 1311. So the king, Philippe le Bel, so he authorizes what are called, small usury rates. It's a usury rate that is considered acceptable, which is 12%, 2%, and so today it still holds true, and the maximum rate, which is for consumer loans, and the king says it twice. This is a depenalization, so it is still actually a sin from a theological standpoint to ask for a profit on a consumer-based loan. But the king says, I will not actually initiate proceedings against small usury lenders, only those who actually ask for a rate that's above the authorized rate. And this concept has remained, and in fact, it's decriminalized, and as of the 14th century. So in reality, we come to the end of the theoretical discussions, thanks to the position taken by the king at the time, Philippe le Bel. So to actually make legitimate the practice of commercial capital by all, this is a complete other scene, as we have the people from the Genovese and Indians. All the Genovese are merchants. So we have to take it for granted that all the Genovese, even if they may be lawyers, doctors, butchers, you name it. I mean, they are authorized to invest and through that investment to gain a profit. This is one of the other justifications. And the third route, in the case of capital that's kept by force by another person. So if a merchant has a capital that is taken from him, either because he's been late in reimbursing the loan or other terms and conditions, he is entitled to the remuneration of the money he could have made. So let's not forget Milton Friedman, and so in the 14th century canon law specialist. So it's the profit that has not been gained, it has to be reimbursed. And especially in the case of the loans awarded to cities, when a city buy actually titles to the public that we consider to be a forced loan. And so they are remunerated legitimately, sort of securities. So all merchants can invent, in the public debt securities, and in Narbonne, it's, loans awarded to the consul and a merchant at the time of Olivi, and it's a merchant who actually gives up the profit of an operation he may have done in Paris or in the Champagne fair, and as a compensation he will get the rate of profit made by such and such a merchant. And in the document we always see is that at the end of the 3 years, when the 3 years have expired, the profit 15% according to such and such an operation made by such and such a merchant. I mean, if the merchant has lost, he will have a negative compensation. So here are the items that have made legitimate the generalization of this compensation of a return of capital, but everything shouldn't be considered as a capital. So I'm going to talk to you about now the word of value, valor in Italian. So it's not classical Latin, but it's not. It sees it as a sort of so in the Visigoths in Spain in the 7th and 8th century, but the word is used in the same region in Barcelona, and that's where we see the word valor applied to goods. So this is a document regarding an exchange of land between. It's a monastery that wants to extend, and the decides to exchange land with its neighbors, and there's a term that says they would be entitled to a land in such and such a place where you're able to actually maintain the same value in the same city of Barcelona. So this is, we see it's highly localized, and again, it's not outside of the city. So it's a piece of land of the same value. This is the first trace of this word valor applied to goods. And that's an example, one that's also very striking in Valenciennes in 1114. The peace charter, which is the charter of the Commune of Valenciennes that sets the rules of urban justice. And there is a term that says, if someone takes someone else's good and feels entitled to do so, and there's a problem, someone whose goods have been actually taken away from him, and he wants to obtain justice, and he has no right to do so, of course, and you have to go, and in case if the thing is no longer apparent, it doesn't exist anymore because it's been spent, and the other one swears the value, the other person will have to actually return it within 7 days, and you have to swear of the value of the res, the thing, the good. So it's interesting to understand why it's not the word price. So precium is a word very often used. That's why we need another word, valor, as well as pretium. The pretium defines something that is not the price as we see it today. Pretium at the time means the thing that is given in exchange. So it's in a contract. So when you exchange one good for another, the transfer from one good in exchange of another good, and the counter transfer is defined as pretium, and it can be in the shape of money, something else, but there's no abstract concept. It's something very concrete. So valor, on the other hand, actually expresses this abstract value when there's still the value. If it doesn't exist anymore, there's no exchange as such. There's the value attributed to such and such a thing. So the question is the question of the fair price. Does the price have a fair value? That is the argument behind all of this. Just one word, very quickly to say, around 1100, the word or the idea of valor has spread quite widely, because of Guy Ier, who was the Chartreuse, who very have actually abandoned social life. And there's a sentence that says it's not according to their value. He uses the word Valencia, which is a classical Latin. So it's a way of you use a classical word by giving it a new meaning, but it's not according to the value that we are happy about its acquisition or sad about its loss, but the distinction between a value in the context of an exchange and the value concept in the context of a usage, something that you use. Sorry. So Guy, the first. So I wanted to tell you about Albert the Great. This is where we see where you see the word valor appearing, in the philosopher's writing. So Dominican, German, and actually did his classes in Padova in philosophy and medicine, and becomes a master of theology in Paris. And is a master of Thomas Aquinas. And in 1248, he's made responsible by the Dominican order to set up a new study center in Cologne. And he goes off with Thomas of Aquinas as his assistant. And in Cologne, he decides to actually organize a new study curriculum. And so this is a new basis for the course of theology with new text. So new Platonician, and on the other hand, the moral and natural philosophy of Aristotle. So he gives classes on Aristoteles and his philosophy. In the first complete translation, it was just finished by Robert Grostet in England, and Albert the Great comments it. So, and Book 5, the famous passage you all know on the justice in exchange, the famous square, that Marx used, the exchange between a mason and a cobbler, and how you calculate the fair exchange. And Aristotle has said the exchange follows a diagonal. It's fair, the exchange, when the reciprocal need of the thing of someone else is considered equal. So Albert the Great has this text before his very eyes, and he doesn't understand. And for him, he doesn't understand, and he corrects us, and he gives a whole explanation after mentioning what was in the text, and he reproduces the drawing. He says, no, the fair proportion can only happen according to the lateral lines, the sides, and the relationship between one to the production of that very one. So an equal or fair exchange when the exchange is between things of the same value. The use of the valeur transforms the concept of exchange, and there's no concept, there's no equivalent with Aristotle and things that have values of different sizes. There's not this concept of an abstract calculation of a value. It's not the same thing as money, not at all. Valeur, you can think money without thinking about valeur. So Aristotle has no meaning. He totally reformulates it, and he believes, wrongly so, that the only real way of measuring things is through labor. And so this, the need was replaced by opus. There's two words, opus, and an expression. That means there is a need for, and opus is also, the labor accomplished, the work, whatever has been produced. And grosse tête makes a play of words, pun on the two meanings of the word that Albert doesn't understand, and Albert considers opus to mean labor. It's the only way to measure this is labor. So this is what he says. So major question, how can you measure the value of things? And his answer is that he gives us the first definition of value at the end of this passage. If we take the artificial measure of things, you can't measure everything with money, but the house. If you can measure one house, if you compare it with other houses, the standard house, or of whatever size, if you need to measure it according to their species. But if you think according to their accident, you measure according to their accident. According to Aristotle, it's something that is not substantial. It happens sort of per chance, and it's a contingency, so per accident, and which is not it doesn't reflect their own being. If you measure it according to their incidence, which is to be appreciated, whether they are, whatever the use is made of them by the community, everything that can have a measure can be the most a certain price. So what it means, the first philosophical definition of value, it's something that happens by accident. It's a quality of things. It's a quality which is to be, you can appreciate it according to the use that can made of it by the community. It has no such thing as an individual value. It's the collective interest or collective value. That's how you can appreciate whatever thing it is, and actually attribute a certain value, which it doesn't mean that it's the same thing as money. So Thomas of Aquinas has worked on the same comment, and I'm going to go straight to Olivier, who uses the formula of Thomas of Aquinas on a precise point. There's a sort of prerequisite, so we can understand the value, give it two meanings, the value. And Thomas also says in St. Augustine's passages the word valeur, so value applied to things, and it can also be applied to individuals, to all sorts of things. But valeur is an abstract word which means grandeur, and in the 13th century in Paris you have a music theoretician, the first that's measured by the valeur, which means the relative duration of such and such a note, C, D, E, F, G, whatever. And you have this in music, and it comes from the 13th century Jérôme de Mauriac, who's a Scotsman. So the value can relate to different things, and it can have a moral dimension. And Thomas of Aquinas In the first place, the value of things can be understood according to the real goodness of their nature. So, in fact, a mouse or an ant has more value than bread because they have a soul, life, and meaning, and not the bread, according to the second mode. It is understood in relation to our usage, and so again, the more useful they are in terms of how we can use them, they will actually be worth more, and that is why bread is worth more than a mouse or a toad. And since the actions entailing selling and buying are part of the usages of human life, and they themselves are the value of things to sell is understood and measured according to the second mode and not the first. So there's the usage, the scarceness, and the individual preferences. You have to also take into account the cost of labor and the risks that are entailed. And there's a physical work, the intellectual work, which is industria, the know-how, and the risk. These three elements, and you have a panel that are, give or take, they actually are going to be used to define the value that have been reformulated in modern economic thought. So I'll stop here for this first part of my presentation. So you see there's a whole vocabulary. It's not a theoretical thought process. It's based on practices and usages of these very words. It's extremely rich and very close to what it is that we use, and at the same time very far. And I already told you that we need to reformulate things in something that's fundamental on the question of risk and profit, and the need to make it see the difference between interest rate and yield rate of capital. It's not the same concepts at all, and it's important to understand, why there's been some confusion on these two concepts. And if we consider that at the end of the day, any money constitutes capital, I mean, we're off to a bad start. And if we consider that we have to include in the definition itself, capital, the future profit, integrating future profit, you lose the meaning of the fundamental distinction. So the concept of risk as a responsibility regarding possible profit or gain, I think that's completely disappeared in a contemporary definition, and you have to you shouldn't lose the distinction, which is the basis of medieval accounting systems. This is my position. But the question that's of interest here today is how to reformulate concepts in the view of ecological accounting or ecological political philosophy and the different levels of analysis that are required. And if we think this way, what is the meaning of a capital today? If we think in terms of ecological accounting, I mean, it's the planet that hasn't been given to us. That's very interesting, and we don't own this earth on which we live, so it's a capital per se. I think that this is very important. This notion, this ecological thought, shouldn't be based on economic categories. No, it has to actually differentiate itself. So the earth belongs to itself. I mean, we are not the owners of the earth. So the issue of risks and profits are not to be thought in terms of ourselves. We're not talking about services rendered by nature. It's very dangerous to go down that road. And this is services that the nature renders upon itself. I think it's better to talk about the planet rather than nature. It's perhaps difficult from a philosophical and theological standpoint to talk about nature. Let's talk about the planet, which is very concrete. It's a concrete entity. It can be a legal entity, and you can subdivide it in different geographical and geological things. I mean, like a catchment area for one could be one item, and a planet, nature as a capital per se. You have to rethink very differently other notions. This is the first thing I wanted to say. Also, second thing I wanted to say very quickly. So, do I still have a few minutes? 5 minutes? Okay. So, So if I've insisted a lot on this passage of Pierre de Jean Olivier, it's because we need to think about the difference between two levels of value. So this is something that may seem very banal, and it's become banal because it's been totally confused because of the philosophy of values, and also because of an operation we owe to the enemy of value, who is Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche, by proposing the transformation of all values, and quite paradoxical, has introduced the word value and has actually given it a philosophical meaning, and quite willingly referring to an economic value that has actually returned to an economic vocabulary to talk about the plurality of values, the war between values, and talking to criticize the bourgeois values derived from Christianity, and to offer a transvocation and an affirmation of other values, of the will for power. I don't want to entertain Nietzsche's proposal, but I think it's important to understand where our vocabulary comes from, and to present to the public this concept of value, and to the people who had in mind concepts that were very different and totally incompatible with one another. They considered value as something very, very different, and to try and explain at the time, I had a sort of a general mapping of the different meanings of the word, and it's an extremely complex word. It's a word, it is not a concept that includes several concepts. And even if we see in this word the idea of the abstract measure, abstract social measure, but we have several meanings around this word. I think this first meaning that we give to our values, plural, for what values are we going to fight for? The ecology needs values at all, and you can't limit it to the question of the planet as a capital to be defended, because if you remain entrenched with this vision, you're sort of trapped, and so that's why it's so interesting to come back to the medieval economic meaning. So it's a subordinate to morals and politics. It's not bad. It doesn't mean that you have to have a state-based system of the economy to come back to the punitive aspect as we had in the past. But we have to the economic act that can be both thought as ecological. What is the impact on the natural system, and from a moral standpoint, is what we're doing just, and what Olivier insisted so much, and is not obsolete at all, is the idea that we each have the capacity of self-limiting ourselves. But Olivier says the following: people who are fair are able to know where to stop, to just take the share that is due to them, and to have a decent behavior, to not take more than is fair. So yes, you have people, in a negotiating process, you have people who may take more than what they feel they are due, and so there's a moral side to things, and there's a political notion, and the act must be compatible with the maintaining of a collective life. It is another way of reformulating it. So this comes from the reading of Olivier into this concept of self-limitation, and to think not totally dominating this planet, but the way of defending and to showing respect to its own capital, which is not ours. And we only have sort of a life interest, without forgetting about this self-limitation and measuring a gain. I think that's what's fundamental. It's the individual gain has meaning only if we look at the impact it has on the totality of the system. Give or take, that would be the general idea I'd like to pass on as a message after the reading of the medieval text. I don't know how you can translate it in an accounting context today, but I think it's pretty much in line with what you're trying to do, and I hope it'll be very useful for you.